Okay, so welcome back to Humanistic Psychology here at the University of West Georgia. Today, we're going to be talking once again about Abraham Maslow's The Farthest Reaches of Human Nature. In our last video, we got through chapter 4 out of the book, which had to do with the nature of creativity, which, as I keep saying, is a recurrent motif definitely within humanistic psychology. But now we're going to skip to a much later part of the book, so skipping ahead all the way to page 270 to 286, where Maslow will be taking up what he calls Theory Z. Okay, so here's the main idea behind that segment of the book. That basically, that topmost part of the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs that has to do with self-actualization needs, actually, that topmost part is divided into two sections. Usually it's not presented that way, but when we look at Maslow's thinking in greater detail, it actually turns out that way. So the two sections are going to be named Theory Z and Theory Y. And basically, what you ought to be inferring at this point is that there are actually two ways of going about self-actualization. Okay, so two different ways. Now, Theory Z is going to be at the very topmost part of the pyramid. Theory Y is going to be a little bit underneath it, and then we get down to the layers of psychological needs and then physiological needs all the way at the bottom of the pyramid. So Theory Z is going to be at the topmost part. So what is Theory Z? Theory Z has to do with people whose self-actualization involves peak experiences or possibly plateau experiences. Okay, so here we're introducing a variation on peak experiences. You already know what peak experiences are from earlier videos. But a plateau experience is, and here's how Maslow describes it, has to do with serene and contemplative B cognitions rather than climactic ones. Okay, so here's how to get a handle on what a plateau experience is. Like a peak, think of it in terms of topography. A peak is like a mountain, a high mountain that rises up very suddenly and has like a very pointed peak to it, and then it falls very suddenly too. So sometimes our experiences are a little bit like that we have experiences of deep revelation or communion with God possibly, or union with the cosmos, or feeling our fundamental participation in life itself, and the experience comes on relatively suddenly, rises to a very high height, and then drops off fairly quickly too. But sometimes our experience rises up not quite so high and levels off and endures for a while and then slopes off again. So it's a little bit like a plateau in terms of topography. All right, so if you can hang with that metaphor or comparison, then hopefully that makes sense to you. So like I said, he describes it in terms of serene and contemplative B cognitions rather than climactic ones. So Theory Z involves some combination of these peak and or plateau experiences. Now, Maslow calls people who would be in this Theory Z category, here's some of the vocabulary he uses at this point in the book, peakers. Okay, so people who are peakers or transcenders. He views them as more thoroughly in the B realm. Okay, so what's the B realm again? That has to do with the kind of motivations that are not, for the most part, driven by deficiencies in our lives, but rather driven by the fulfillment of our being. So they're more about the fulfillment of our being. They're more, as he says, meta-motivated. Now here you have to remember what I told you one or two videos ago, that prefix meta for Maslow is kind of a marker, a linguistic marker of self-actualization. So what he's saying is that these Theory Z people whose self-actualization involves peak experiences or plateau experiences, are at the topmost part of the pyramid. Okay, and he gives us a few examples from history that you may know about. So Aldous Huxley, the famous author of Brave New World, would be one. He mentioned him earlier, or we mentioned him, and also Maslow mentions him earlier when we were talking in a previous video about how self-actualization is not about sort of heightening your grandiosity or your arrogance, and he pointed to Aldous Huxley as a great example of that. So the author Aldous Huxley, Albert Schweitzer, famous doctor, 20th century doctor working in Africa, the Judaic existential theologian Martin Buber, and of course Albert Einstein. I think you know who he is, the famous physicist. All right, so And then, okay, so that's theory Z. Now let's talk a little bit about theory Y, which is the next lower layer, still within self-actualization. By the way, this would be an obvious slam dunk test question, like what do theory Z and theory Y have in common? And the answer would be they're both modes of self-actualization. Obvious test question. Word to the wise. Okay, so if you're in my class, that is. So theory Y has to do with people who, once again, are self-actualizing, but their self-actualization does not involve, for the most part, peak experiences or plateau experiences. So here's some of his vocabulary within this part of the book. Non-peakers, as opposed to peakers, merely healthy, he calls them, more, and now here's a quote, practical, realistic, mundane, capable, and secular people. So people whose self-actualization involves that kind of way of being. So they're a little bit more toward the D realm, and he also gives us some examples of that. So Roosevelt, okay, the president, not Teddy Roosevelt. I don't think he means Teddy Roosevelt. I think he means Franklin D. Roosevelt. Truman and Eisenhower. Interesting, all those presidents followed one another chronologically, and moreover interesting, they're all political figures as opposed to, let's see, the author, the doctor, the theologian, and the scientist he mentioned under theory Z. So that gives you a rough sense of the terrain of theory Z and theory Y. Now, remember in our last video when we were talking about the distinction between primary creativeness and secondary creativeness, and I said a typical trick of Maslow is to make a kind of binary distinction, set up one element of the binary distinction as being more towards self-actualization, then he'll spend 95% of his time exploring that. He does the exact same thing in this part of the book. So this time he's going to be spending 95% of his time on theory Z and not on theory Y. So once again, a long list of descriptors of what theory Z looks like. It's entitled Characteristics of Transcenders. So once again, Transcenders is a code word for theory Z people. Now, when we were looking at chapter 4, I told you, or there was another list of descriptors of primary creativeness, that the way to study this and the way to learn this is to let each one of those descriptors be a kind of paintbrush stroke across a canvas that's trying to paint a picture of what something looks like. In chapter 4 it was primary creativeness. Now it's theory Z. I suggest you take the same approach here. I suggest you do not necessarily go trying to memorize this list of 23 attributes. Instead, get the sense for what the picture looks like, and that'll hold you in good stead, I think, when test 3 time comes around. Okay, so let's make note of each one of these. I'll try to go through these relatively quickly because I'm hoping to get through the Maslow stuff in this video. That's part of why I'm talking quickly, too. So, descriptor number 1. So what are we talking about again? What is going on in the lives of these theory Z people? People who are self-actualizing and who also experience peak and or plateau experiences. Okay, so descriptor number 1. Peak and plateau experiences tend to be the most important thing in their lives. In other words, it's sort of like for people who are like this, who are living this way, it's like peak and plateau experiences are the kind of experiences that make sense of all the other kind of stuff you have to go through in your life. For instance, have you ever sort of wondered, like, why do you have to get good grades? Why do you have to pay the bills? Why do you have to get a decent salary other than, you know, to provide yourself with creature comfort? Well, for these theory Z people, the answer to that is they really want to get at these peak and plateau experiences in their lives as much as possible. And so they do all the nitty-gritty practical details they have to get through in their life precisely to open up those moments when they can experience these elevated states of being. Okay, so peak and plateau experiences tend to be the most important thing in their lives. Number 2, these theory Z people, they tend to speak in a different kind of language than the rest of us do. So they tend to speak in what he calls B language, the kind of language that would go along with the ultimate fulfillment of our being. They do that much more easily, much more fluidly. So they speak, according to his description, in the language of poets much more often, the language of mystics, seers, profoundly religious people. So what you ought to be inferring, even at this point in the list, which is a relatively early point, is that these theory Z people are sort of in a different mode of living, a different way of moving through life than the rest of us, and it's reflected in their linguistic practices. Okay, so number 3, they tend to perceive things unitively or sacrally. Unitively means in terms of large overarching wholes, and sacrally means in terms of the sacred, in case you didn't know those words in English. So they tend to be able to see the sacred, to perceive the sacred within the mundane. And you've heard about this theme before in the earlier Maslow videos, and I exemplified it a little bit from a couplet from William Blake. So they're able to see the world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, to hold infinity in the palm of their hands and eternity in an hour. A slight paraphrase, but it's still mostly Blake. Okay, so they're able to perceive the intimations of the holy, the intimations of music in the sounds that fill our ears. They're able to perceive the name of God as it's carried in the wind that surrounds us and things like that. Okay, so they have a different way of perceiving the world even. Number 4, B experiences and B values are their most important motivations. Consequently, they're more meta-motivated. Okay, so once again, let's remind ourselves that prefix meta from the Greek, which normally means, in Greek it means something like beyond or across. Okay, in Spanish it means meta is a kind of a goal. Okay, so they tend to be more meta-motivated, which means they're higher up on the hierarchy of needs. Okay. So number 5 may seem to be a little bit creepy when you first read about it. Number 5, these Theory Z people tend to be able to recognize each other. So to bring this down to earth a little bit for you, like, let me give you an example that maybe you've experienced something like this in your own life. Have you ever sort of realized that actually as you move through your life, you're actually part of 2 families at the same time? First, there's the obvious family, right? Family in the most obvious sense, the DNA-driven sense of, well, you know, you share alleles with your brothers and sisters and uncles and aunts and all of that kind of stuff. But then there's the other sense of family, which is that actually you're also part of a kind of spiritual kinship. And maybe for some of you, because if you're young enough, maybe you haven't sort of tuned into this. For instance, like if you ever just instantaneously liked someone for no damn good reason, like you can't even name it, like why you like this person. You can't explain it to yourself, not in any rational way, but you have this affinity for another person, and it's like you're finishing each other's sentences, you know what the other person is thinking, you're just having a great time, like you get each other's jokes like immediately. I think that part of what's going on there is that you're actually having contact with part of your spiritual family, like there's your spiritual brothers and sisters and cousins and people like that. That's what I think, that's one way of understanding, I think, what's going on in moments like that. So if you've had that experience, maybe number 5 makes a little bit of sense to you, that these Theory Z people tend to be able to recognize one another. And so I exemplified that for you in your notes with a few lines, or a couple lines from Shakespeare's play, Henry V. So it's a famous scene, a very, very famous battle in France at a place called Agincourt where these lines occur. So, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers, for he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother or sister, by the way. Okay, so, and by the way, that is where they got the name for the TV series. So, he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Okay, so like if you've ever had that kind of connection with other human beings, you know, a lot of the time I think we get this when we have to go through hardships with each other, you know, oftentimes. Like graduate school was sort of like that for me. At any rate, okay, so let's keep on with the list because I don't want this video to get too long. So these Theory Z people, what else is going on with them? They tend to be more responsive to beauty in the world. Like they tend to be sort of more open and more moved by experiences of beauty. So they have them more often, more intensely. things like that. So she walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies, and all that's best and dark and bright meet in her aspect and in her eyes. Oh, that's actually Byron. I wish I said it, but I didn't. So she walks in beauty like the night of cloudless climes and starry skies. You know, so these Theory Z people, if you can sort of hang with a couple lines of poetry, I know I'm sort of maybe stressing you slightly if you're not into poetry, but if you can hang with that for a little bit, I'm looking down to make sure my microphone's still on. I actually knocked it off this morning, interacting with the cat in the middle of a video. So, beautiful cat, more responsive to beauty. Number 7, they tend to be more holistic. OMG, ROFL. I am staggered by the fact that this would appear in one of these lists. And by the way, that is sarcasm, in case you're not used to me and my sort of delivery. Well, of course, because holism is such a big theme within humanistic psychology. So they tend to see life as one, the cosmos as one. We kind of already said this, or Maslow did, when he was saying, well, they tend to perceive things more unitively and sacrally. Well, this is kind of a repetition of that. All right, so number 8, relatedly, again, a tendency toward synergy. In other words, they tend not to see things in terms of binary and separable categories. Like a lot of times, we who are not in Theory Z category tend to perceive things in terms of categories like right and wrong, good and bad, left and right, you know, things like that, and never the twain shall meet. Well, these people in Theory Z tend to be able to see things in terms of different shadings and colorations and textures and stuff like that, rather than relatively simplistic binary dichotomies. A dichotomy is just sort of a way of, well, literally from the Greek, it means to cut into two, either or, stuff like that. So, number 9, they're more able to transcend the ego and the self, to transcend, to get past the normal sense of who we are. And here we were talking about something very similar to this in the last video about creativity, that part of what primary creativeness involves is being able to get past your normal sense of yourself and enter into a kind of selflessness, or an an-atman state is how I was describing it in the previous video, where all you really are is a pouring forth into the infinite depth of the moment. Okay, in creative experience. Well, a similar kind of thing going on here in Theory Z. And by the way, I guess maybe what you might infer at this point is that you're studying of that business about primary creativeness, and you're studying of the stuff about Theory Z. A lot of the descriptors are sort of alike, you know, so you get almost double duty for the studying. Number 10. This is how number 10 has to do with how they tend to appear to other people. So these Theory Z people tend to seem more awe-inspiring in a particular way, or unearthly, or saintly, or like they are not just vanilla cookie-cutter people, for sure, even at the raw level of their presence. You know, so these are different kinds of people. Number 11, they're more likely to be innovators and discoverers, or I would add, creative people, because that forms a linkage to what we were talking about in the previous video. They're not sort of held back or pinned down or tied up as much as the rest of us are, so they're more likely to seek out the new and the surprising, and take delight in discovering new things and creating new things and all of that. Now, number 12 is where they start to pay a price, because thus far it probably seems like, wow, this Theory Z, it sounds so cool, like I wish I could be a Theory Z person or something like that. But number 12, they sort of pay the piper for being able to dance. So, he says, they tend to be more prone to be sadness, or be sadness. So that's the kind of, maybe melancholy would be a better word for it, or perhaps the tragic sense of life. That's actually the title of a book. But the tragic sense of life. So these people embody a greater openness to the tragic. And Maslow comments, perhaps this is the price these people have to pay for their direct seeing of the beauty of the world. Okay, so it's like, yeah, it's really cool to be more directly present, more fully present to the grandeur of the universe. But there's a price to be paid, because the more open you are to beauty, probably the more open you are to ugliness and pain too. Okay, so you don't get it for free. Number 13, they tend to live simultaneously in both the D and B realms. So they're able, part of what's going on with these Theory Z people is they're able to strike a balance between meeting the practical, deficiency-driven demands of life, which is inevitably a part of life. It's part of that whole pyramid. In fact, it's 2/3 of the pyramid. But they're also able to balance that against fulfilling their being. Okay, so they're able to strike a fruitful balance between those two things. Number 14, they tend to be more in touch with the correlation between increasing knowledge and increasing mystery and awe. So this may seem like a little bit of a tension or contradiction or something like that, but I bet it's one that maybe you've tuned into slightly in your studies in college, because one of the weird lessons that knowing more things can have for you is this. It's like the more you know you don't know. You get it? Like, and why is that? Because each and everything you learn, let's say in your college classes, points to other things that you could possibly learn, but that you don't know yet. And the same thing is true for the entire stock of knowledge that's part and parcel of humanity. So humanity's stock of knowledge also points to things that humanity, we human beings, could possibly know that we don't know yet. So the weird thing about increasing your knowledge is that it can also very easily increase your sense of how mysterious things are. All right? So like, you live in a mysterious world. Have you sort of tuned into that yet? Like, you live in a miraculous, mysterious world. If you haven't tuned into this as a function of your educational process, I would suggest possibly opening yourself to that possibility. In one of the previous videos, I was saying, I hope that you're learning to unknow the world, just as you're learning to know the world better. You know, well, it's easy to sort of validate and valorize the knowing of the world because our society does it for us. But the trickier thing is to find value in the opening of mystery, which is part and parcel of knowledge, right? Because every bit of knowledge points beyond itself. Okay, so let's see, where were we? Number 14. God, I wish someone had told me that when I was 19, so I get to tell you. That's my revenge against the educational system I had to go through. They tend to be more in touch with the correlation between increasing knowledge and increasing mystery and awe, the sense of awe before the grandeur and depth and beauty of the universe. Like, the more you know, I would say that this is the deep point of knowing. The deep point of knowing is to open yourself more to the inherent beauty of things, the inherent miraculous nature of things, the inherent mysteriousness of things, and consequently to open yourself more to the experience of finding awe in the moments of your life. Like, that would be sort of the deep rationale for knowing things, rather than, well, you got to know things to have a job. Okay, everyone wants a good job. No one's debating that. All right, but what's the deep point of your life at this point, since you're in college? You ever wonder about that? Like what's really going on at this point in your life? Interesting question to ask. Whether you're my age, I'm about to turn 60, so or whether you're your age, and I'm guessing maybe you're like 20 years old or something like that if you're watching this. Okay, so 15. These Theory Z people tend to be less afraid of unconventional people. His way of putting it is nuts and kooks are people that you might regard as sort of nutty people, something like that. So they tend to value relatively creative, unconventional people rather than sort of predictable people who say the obvious thing all the damn time. And, you know, I don't know, you ever get sort of tired of that in yourself? Sometimes I get tired of that in myself. You ever sort of listen to what you say and it's like, damn, I say so many dull, stupid things, and maybe I should drop that habit and just start speaking in interesting, powerful ways, and drop the habit of just saying dull, stupid, dumb, shallow, predictable things all the time. So these 15, in item number 15, these Theory Z people are seemingly on the road, at least, to doing that. So I exemplified this one for you by a quote from Jack Kerouac. Okay, so who was Jack Kerouac? He was one of the Beat authors. The Beats were a group of people in the, late 40s into the 50s, possibly early 60s. So they were sort of like hippies before there were hippies, like hippies from the 50s, if you can sort of imagine that. And a lot of them were interested in existential philosophy and writing and poetry and things like that. So Jack Kerouac was one of these famous characters, along with people like Allen Ginsberg and so on. So the only ones for me are the mad ones. You know, the ones that never yawn or say a commonplace thing but explode like spiders across the stars. I'm quoting actually from the book, all right? So in case you thought I had a psychotic break, no, I had a psychotic break a long time ago. So the only ones for me are the mad ones, the ones who are desirous to live, you know, desiring everything at the same time, who explode like spiders across the stars. So these Theory Z people are attracted to people like that. Okay, number 16. Now, number 16 is going to have a sort of paradox in it. So they tend to be more, quote, reconciled with evil. Okay, so in other words, these Theory Z people recognize the inevitability of evil and darkness. Why? Because it's inevitable, because we're all bearers of it. You know, it's part of our gestalt. It's the part that we tend not to want to recognize or incorporate into our vision of who we think we're about, but it's there nonetheless. So they're more reconciled with the inevitability of darkness and evil, and they feel more compassion for it. Why? Because it's just part of the human experience, really. But paradoxically, they're able to take a stand against it, too. So that's a kind of tension, like to feel compassion for something and able to stand against it at the same time. And if that sounds like, well, that seems like an unattainable kind of paradox, it's like, well, yeah, life itself is full of unattainable paradoxes that we're challenged with all the time. So that doesn't mean that it's valueless. All right, number 17. These Theory Z people are more likely to see themselves as the carriers or instruments of something greater. And in an earlier video, we were talking about developing a sense for mission, right? When we were talking about that, well, all these self-actualizing people are involved in causes outside their own skin. And I quoted that from The Farther Reaches of Human Nature, page 42, if memory serves. I believe it does. But at any rate, it's the same idea here. So to see themselves as participants in something larger than themselves, whether that's a spiritual or a religious kind of mission, or whether it's more secular, like, participating in the ongoing processes of transcendence that move through and across the universe, is a derivative question at this point. So to see themselves as instruments of something greater. Now, okay, so once again, the camera shut off to remind me to get on with it and see if I can finish this video relatively quickly. So here's a point I'm trying to make about number 17. Like, insofar as you see yourself as a participant in something much greater than yourself, there's this tendency in that to undercut whatever seduction feeling arrogant or self-important or self-centered or self-powerful has for you. And probably there's some kind of seduction for all of us in that kind of stuff. But if you're really able to see yourself as a participant in the universe, or as an expression of God's will, if you're religious in that sense, or on the road to something like nirvana, not the band, but the experience of nirvana, in other words, a state of enlightenment, would be a way of glossing that, I suppose, then it tends to undercut whatever temptation you feel to feel sort of self-important or hyper ego inflated or something like that. Because, whatever greatness you have may be wonderful, but it's only playing out against a backdrop that is immeasurably greater than that. You're simultaneously important and unimportant, right? You're simultaneously large and small. Again, another paradox. All right, so number 18, these Theory Z people tend to be more profoundly religious or spiritual, and maybe you were getting that sense from how I was just describing the earlier item on the list. Okay, so like if you really feel yourself a participant in life, let's say, in all of the complex dynamisms of life, the wonderful and terrifying and painful and ecstatic dynamisms of life itself, well, maybe that translates pretty quickly to being more profoundly spiritual or religious. Like when earlier in the video when I was saying, well, you know, have you ever considered the possibility that you're part of a spiritual family above and beyond your DNA-driven family? You know, like that might be an expression of the same thing. Okay, number 19, again, a kind of paradox. They tend to have strong selves, but they're also more likely to transcend their selves. So again, here comes this motif of getting past the self that you normally think you are. But there's something new here. And it's the idea that you have to have a strong self to get past yourself. All right? You have to have a strong self. You have to be confident enough. You have to be trusting enough that if you let go of the self that you normally cling to very tightly, that everything will be okay. That, you know, if you open the wings of your soul to the winds that surround you, that caress you, like maybe a lover. If you were to open yourself to making love with the universe as you move from moment to moment in your life, well, the thing about that is you have to be kind of confident. You have to be kind of trusting, confident enough in yourself to get past yourself, all right, to be able to do that. So they have strong selves, these Theory Z people, but they're also more likely to transcend themselves. And those two are connected. Like, you're not going to be able to transcend yourself if you're neurotically insecure about whether you're good enough and whether you can really trust things, and, you know, if you're trying to like control stuff all the damn time because you're insecure about your place in the universe somehow, it's going to be hard as hell for you to transcend yourself. Number 20, more open to childlike fascination and wonder. We saw that again in chapter 4. So these Theory Z people are, they're sort of like big kids in a way, you know, in their attitude and posture toward life. 21, they're more Taoistic. Oh my goodness, another reference to Taoism. We saw that in the last video. And less driven by the normal sense of having to get stuff done, usefulness, practicality, and so on. Instead, dwelling in beauty, like we saw before, and I quoted, who did I quote? Byron for that, as their principal motivation in life. 22, these Theory Z people tend toward more wholehearted love rather than the usual mixture of love and hate. I think most of the time, most of us have a love-hate relationship with life. Like, there's certain stuff we love about it and certain stuff we hate about it. Well, these Theory Z people tend to be more toward the love end of the spectrum rather than the hate end of the spectrum. Okay, number 23, they tend to be more tuned into higher forms of pay, is how he puts it. Now, this is just a sort of a quasi-poetic way of talking about intrinsic motivation, all right, which is a theme we've seen many times this semester. So intrinsic motivation means they do things more for their own internal value and for their own reasons. Things begin to take on their own reasons as you move a little further higher up the pyramid of needs. So you're less driven by external factors like how much you're getting paid and how much status other people are going to accord you and whether they think you're cool or not and so on. And the things that you do, you start to do because of their own inherent value. Well, these Theory Z people are more like that. So they're less motivated by extrinsic factors like money, status, power, prestige, stuff that comes from the external world. And finally, the very last thing, because this is already too long, he ends this segment with an epilogue, and there's something a little surprising about this. So he does a little bit of research, it turns out, about how often these Theory Z people tend to appear in different kinds of jobs and vocations. And sort of the obvious thing you would think is, well, I bet these Theory Z people, I bet there's a ton of them among artists and poets and musicians and, you know, the sort of vocations that seem to be inherently creative and expressive and that sort of thing. And what he finds in the research is that that's not actually true, okay? So what he finds is that the proportion of Theory Z people is about the same irrespective of the job or the vocation. So if you look at scientists, or you look at accountants, or you look at engineers, I worked in a software engineering environment. I had a whole career. Before my last regeneration, I had a career as a software engineer. So in an engineering environment where you would probably intuitively think, there wouldn't be much theory Z going on there. Well, actually, he finds there's about the same proportion in an engineering environment or an accounting environment or a scientific environment or a banking environment as among the people that you would intuitively expect. Okay, so that was a little bit of a longer and somewhat collapsed video. I felt a little bit rushed, like I had to talk quickly, but hopefully I gave it enough oomph to paint this picture. Once again, what's the point of this section of the book, besides your knowing about the distinction between theory Z and theory Y, is to get a kind of painted picture, as it were, a kind of colorful canvas full of all of these individual brush strokes. There are 23 of them, but remember the picture, because that's the easy way to study this stuff. And I would say it's also the easy way to have it be meaningful to your own life. If you just turn it into a memorization project, probably it's not going to be very meaningful to you. But if you turn it into a kind of work of art, if you want to think of it that way, then probably it'll be easy to remember and it'll be more meaningful to you. So this ends the stuff on Maslow. In the next video, we're going to take up a new and the last thinker this semester, Rollo May. So until the next video, hope you have a great day. Enjoy your Corona apocalypse. Enjoy your quarantining, however you're doing it. Obviously, I'm making a lot of videos, so take care. Have a good one. Bye-bye.